Week 9 of Literature Concepts is going to have us talking about homophones and homonyms. So before we go too much further with this, we want to talk about what the difference between these two things are and how they are actually connected as well. So first of all, a homophone, this is a term you've probably heard before, at least I hope you have. I know my kids come home all the time and talk about them when they do their spelling lists. So homophone literally means same sound. So these are words that have the same sound, but they have different meanings. So we've looked at some of these words before in some of our other grammar lessons. So words like to and two, but then we see them in your and your, there, there. They're all over the place. So they can be confusing, and we can end up using the wrong word just because the words sound the same, even though they mean totally different things. Homonyms, on the other hand, are words that look the same, and that means homo, again, means same, nym means name. So a homonym, words that are spelled the same but have a different meaning. So again, words like read and read, they look exactly the same, they're pronounced differently, and they mean something slightly different. There is this weird overlap that happens between homophones and homonyms, and we don't see it with very many words, but when we do, they can be especially confusing. So for example, like what you see here on the slide where it talks about bats. The words by themselves, if we saw the word bat, we wouldn't know if it was necessarily talking about the animal or if it was talking about baseball. Usually we use context. We use what's happening around that word in order to understand if it's an animal or if it's from baseball. So it's one of those things that we have to be especially careful of when we talk about the effects of homophones and homonyms in a story. So whether you're reading or writing, these are some of the effects that we want to watch out for. The first one is errors, and we talked about this before, and this is kind of why we did two and two, is because if we use the wrong word, it can mean something different, and it can negatively impact your writing. It causes the reader to stop and to kind of think really hard about what it is that the author was trying to say. It kind of messes up the whole thing. This reminds me of a friend of mine who was a really good student, and one time he wrote a creative story where he talked about toxic waste, and he wrote W-A-I-S-T, so like the waste of your pants, which at the time I tried to correct him, and I said, you used the wrong waste. You want W-A-S-T-E. And he argued with me, and he said, no, I've got the right one. Looking back at it as an adult, it kind of makes for a funny story, because it's like the toxic waste, like what's going on below the belt that's so toxic. So yeah, it's a little funny now. At the time, though, like I said, there's some confusion there. So we don't intend to do these things. They're mistakes, and we don't want them to happen. So we need to kind of check and make sure. The other way that this kind of comes into play, or one of the other effects, is ambiguity, which means that it's not really right or wrong, but it can kind of confuse the reader. And sometimes, like it says here, that authors will do that on purpose in order to kind of keep the reader hanging in the balance. So, for example, there are too many bats in the tool shed. Well, this is kind of the example from before. We don't have enough understanding to know if it's talking about, what's used in baseball, or if it's literal, like, animal bats hanging from the rafters of the shed. So this can kind of keep us guessing as we read. Usually you don't see authors do this too much, but it is one way that we can use homophones and homonyms to kind of help us tell a story. And the last way, the one that a lot of us are familiar with, are the use of puns. So puns are that humorous device where you kind of substitute those words. A lot of times you joke around and call them dad puns. But again, using a word on purpose because it has kind of a multiple meaning or a kind of a secondary meaning can kind of give your reader a little bit of a chuckle. And again, a lot of authors, a lot of humor writers will do this, and they'll do it subtly to kind of trick you. So when we do this, like I said, most of the time when you're putting it into practice, you might do it when you're doing a creative writing thing. That might be where you're going to use puns. Or if you're writing any other piece, like I said, usually it's the ones like your, and your, or your, two, and two, there. All those words that kind of sound the same, those are the ones you want to kind of check for. When we read, obviously we want to look for secondary meaning because that can kind of help us understand some things. And like we said already, when it comes to proofreading your stuff, you want to make sure that you're kind of double checking those words that sound the same, and make sure you're using the right word and it has the right meaning. And so that is how we are going to kind of check and use homophones and homonyms.